In some of our previous videos about F50s, including the user's guide, which you may have seen on YouTube, I've often talked about how clever an F50 is in terms of its stressed member engine and gearbox assembly. And simply that means that from the bulkhead behind the seats back, there is no chassis frame. Now, here at DK, because we specialise in F cars more than anyone else in the entire world, we are in the privileged and fortunate position to have not one, not two, but 3 F50s effectively in pieces at the moment. So this is an ideal opportunity to show you exactly what I've been talking about. So first off with the very first car here. Currently, the engine's recently been refitted, bolted back to the bulkhead. The gearbox is still separated from the engine, and this demonstrates perfectly what I mean by the engine being a stressed member. So very much like the process that we saw from the 70s onwards in Formula One cars. So the engine is bolted directly to the bulkhead. There are bolts at the front of it, top and bottom, both sides, and then that's it. It's hanging off the back of the bulkhead behind the driver's seat, and that's all that's holding it in place. There are actually 2 rigidity bars that come from the top corner of the tub back to the gearbox later on, which we'll show you on the last car, but they are just for stiffness, for torsional rigidity. They don't actually act or serve as a chassis frame, so to speak. And as I've said before, on later cars, the Enzo in particular, they go back to a traditional chassis frame coming all the way to the back of the car to support the engine. And I think most of that was because people complained that the F50 was very harsh internally in the cockpit and very noisy. But that's what makes it such a pure, visceral car in my opinion. So moving back to this car, you can see that the gearbox is here, ready to be bolted back onto the engine. And here you can see that the suspension will hang off the side of the gearbox, off the casing of the gearbox. The oil tank for the dry sump system will sit on top of that. And then from there, the rear bumper will fix onto the gearbox, and the rear clam fixes onto the main car and closes down onto that. So there really is no other chassis frame. So if we move on to this next car here. So here are the torsional rigidity bars that I talked about, which just bolt down to the suspension to give the car that lateral stiffness. And we've got this more complete rear end assembly. So you can see now this gearbox has got the suspension hanging off it, both sides, the inboard suspension on the top with the push rod shock absorbers and springs, and then a small subframe at the back to support the rear bumper, the exhaust back boxes, which again are held off a bracket that's mounted on the gearbox, and that's it. And quite literally, we can put the wheels back on this and roll it into the engine, connect them together, put the rear clam on, and the car's complete. Much like this car is just about to be. Having had a rear main oil seal replacement, we've just rolled this back into position. The bumper's still intact, the exhaust is still on, all the suspension's on. It's bolted back up to the engine. We refit the top clam, close it down onto it, and that's a complete car. So it really is just like those Formula One car designs from the 70s onwards and to this day. Engine bolted to the bulkhead, gearbox bolted to the engine, suspension hanging off the gearbox, exhaust hanging off the gearbox, even the rear bumper. No rear chassis frame whatsoever. This car ends at the bulkhead in terms of its chassis, in terms of its tub, the carbon tub. A really clever design, really ahead of its time if you like, and actually for me a bit of a shame that the future cars went backwards by having a rear subframe reinstated, but perhaps that's what you need for comfort. Equally, it's what makes the F50 so special in my opinion.